If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Hello, everyone. It's good morning for me on a beautiful sunny summer day. With new kittens on the deck that we didn't ask for, but we live on a farm. Barn cats are like that. And they are delightful creatures. I want to try today to think a little bit more about ethics. I have, of course, in mind medical students and doctors as being my primary experience of this phenomenon I want to try and talk about. But it goes across the world as well. The easiest thing to say whenever I'm talking to people who want to get off into highfalutin philosophy and as though that will change the world is to ask the question, who are the people in your life that you trust most? In other words, people that are reliable, which surely is one of the essential aspects of ethics, is that you do things you ought to do without being pushed too hard. It is who you are. And of course, what you will discover if you do your own experiment of asking the people you know, those you love and those you merely know, and ask them about how many people they trust, in other words, who have reliable ethics, interesting discussions will emerge because it bears no relationship whatsoever to what goes on in university. From the beginning of my exposure to ethics in medicine, the first attempts at it in London when I was a medical student were basically getting good docs to talk about the way they did medicine. And that I think is a good way to do it and not to pretend to make it into a subject, so to speak. Of course, it has become that now because if you're a member of the liberal intelligentsia, the elite who think they have the right to rule, and then you have horrible things happening, particularly the corruption over stealing money, which I see has even got to the cardinals in the Vatican at the moment. A couple of them have disappeared, and it's going to be publicly discussed because that's what the new Pope wants to do. He comes, after all, from a South American background. That gives you some understanding of where he's coming from. So, ethics only began to be taught as a subject in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And when they arrived at our medical school, I wasn't involved in any way. My opinions on many subjects were known, and I once said to the students, nobody cares about what I say anyway, and they laughed. They said, you should hear what they say about you. I said, they never say it to me, and they laughed again. Of course they won't, because they wouldn't know how to push back. They were just operating on the basis of when they trained, and of course anybody of my age was trained in a deeply anti-Christian medical environment, certainly anti-God. When I started medical school in the 50s, science was going to fix everything. We now know that science doesn't fix everything, and anybody with any proper training knew that to begin with. I mean, that's why we used to read things like Shakespeare, so that the human character was laid out for us in a way that we couldn't miss. My favorite teacher in literature is Wendell Berry's Miss Minnie, who went to Teachers College, where she learnt many cunning techniques that she's never subsequently used, because Miss Minnie loved children and she loved books, and she taught by merely introducing the one to the other. That, I think, is the way to teach ethics. You don't teach them. They're caught, not taught. And once you recognize that, you can start looking around for where you find the real thing. The other giveaway for Christians, of course, is how little what would be now recognized as ethical teaching appears in the New Testament. Paul, who had the greatest human influence after our Lord on the development of the church and its structure, one of the smartest men who ever lived without any question, who could write in 4 pages what a philosopher takes 4 books to fill. But his epistles were all written because the church was screwing up, as it inevitably will, because we are fallen creatures. And conversion redeems us, puts us under new authority, but it doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't pretend to. It's very realistic about God's project being very long-term, and he knows what we're going to do. And he says, I'll still let history run because there is good to come out of this. So each of the epistles was directed at the particular problems of the church to which Paul was writing. And he begins his epistles after his usual greetings by loading that, what's the word I want? Dumping on them almost a whole raft of theological discussion, which many of them would have a great deal of difficulty dealing with, but they got it written, they could talk about it, and they did talk about it. And then he gets through, in the case of Romans, the first 10 chapters or so are all about theology. And then he says, now, you know what you've got to do, don't you? Because if you've understood me, you better get that mind of yours into gear. Because that's what Christians have to do. It's time for you to have your mind renewed by the work of the Holy Spirit within you. And that, of course, happened. Over the centuries, and it is centuries, there's a growth of the Christian mind, Christian discussion. God doesn't lay it all out, remember these things and you're done, like the Muslims think if you memorize the Quran, everything will be all right, and it clearly isn't. I mean, Douglas Murray's wonderful comment, if you are really the owners of the final revelation of the truth of the world and you are going to rule the world, why in 13 centuries have you not produced anything that the world wants? Their comment. They don't win Nobel Prizes. They haven't improved the quality of life for people around the world. They've oppressed women. They've abused children. I mean, Muhammad himself married Aisha at 6 and consummated it at 8 or 9. I mean, that's what he did. And a lot more that we would be ashamed of. So what Paul says is, look, I've laid out the problems. Now here's what you have to do. You have to start thinking about them. So even in Romans, he gets you through to 7 chapters, and then instead of saying, now we can all say how glorious everything is, he says, nevertheless, when you set out every day to do what is good, you often fail. When you set out to avoid evil, it often captures you. He's writing to Christians. And he says, what are we going to do? Who shall deliver us from this problem? And he says, there is a way, thanks be to God, through Jesus Christ our Lord. And then you get in Romans 8, the discussion of how that is to happen. Not if you don't hold your hands in the air and ask the Spirit to come and wipe you clean. That's part of it, if you like. And not if you set out to write down your faults and meditate and write long books. Although that is also important to do. But those two have to come together. if you, through the Spirit, mortify the deeds of the flesh, you will live, you will flourish. The promise goes way back even to the Jews. If you will keep these laws, it will go well with you and your children. But you've got to keep them. And there, of course, the great gift of parenting Jewish style, which they didn't teach to the rest of us. Shame on them for that. We need to do. But they were taught that. Moses rubs the salt in the wound. He says, you broke the 10 Commandments within hours of receiving them. You'd made it an idol. You'd worshipped it. First 2 commandments gone while I was still up the mountain. So what hope is there? He says, there's hope. And he says, that's where the Shema comes. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. That love is not a feeling, because you can't do those things. The heart, mind, and habits. And the place where it has to be put together is the dining room table, the domestic setting, where you, particularly father, who shirks his duty most of the time, we are different. I mean, Christians don't have any problem deciding that men and women are different. We're made for different purposes, and each is better with the other. Men have, whether they like it or not, a certain authority. So if mom is teaching the kids the Bible and taking them to church, but dad plays golf, you know what? The kids say, Dad doesn't believe this. Not in any real sense. That's why we both got to be on the same square. It's father's job to show that this works in his life as well as in mum's life. I mean, obviously, when you're a little kid and you fall over and you have a scratch on your knee or whatever, you run to your mum for comfort and she gives it to you. You run to your dad and he says, oh, get used to it, kid. Suck it up. That's life. It'll heal. My kids used to come to me with their problems and then they'd say, don't tell me it's not mortal, which is what I usually said. And I was right so far 100% of the time, although we've had some fairly serious illness that could have been mortal, but weren't. That's the way it goes. So, right back with the beginning with the Jews, there was the recognition that there's an educational process going on, which is not only now, but it's generational. Jewish children have to learn the history of Jewish leaders, which is disastrous. It's roughly 9-1 on that the guy you're talking to in any business setting is likely to try and cheat you. That's what they learn from their own history. 1 good king for every 9 bad ones or thereabouts. Why does God allow that? I don't know, except that he has done, and that's what we have to learn to come to terms with. I suppose if we made great progress immediately, we'd think we'd done it ourselves. And that's the first thing that has to disappear. So, I get back to the ethics in a minute, but the way I get back to that is by which bits of the Bible help me most in that direction? Well, Psalm 19 is certainly one of them. What C.S. Lewis called the greatest poem that he knew. So beautifully structured. Where it begins with a meditation on what you can see if you look around at nature. Like looking out at the garden today with the irises in beautiful flower. And I've got a whole bunch of very nice ones, courtesy of Ed Blado, whose wife bred irises. And my goodness, they're dramatically good. But you could look out. He looked out at the sun and the sky and nature as a whole, and he was duly impressed. Even Kant later, at the end of the bit that everybody remembers, if they remember anything of Kant, is 2 things, he says, really impressed me. There is the wonder of the heavens above, nature. He understood. You look at nature, and if you're not in some sense awestruck, there's something wrong with your mind. If you've never been awestruck by the world in which we live. Get on your knees and ask God to give you that gift that we should have back, because to be awestruck, to be aware that you're a creature, and more than that, that you are a loved creature, is essential to a flourishing human life. I don't see how you can do it without it. It must be sort of subliminal in a way for many people. But that's where we start. And then, so for Kant even, this sense of awe was important. And then he says, I can look within and see the law within me. I mean, he doesn't give any credit that I'm aware of to where he might have got that idea from, but there it is in Psalm 19, sweeter than honey and the honeycomb. That's the law of the Lord, to meditate on day and night. That's what makes a flourishing life. And people who do that, they may be very humble people. I can think of many who never earned a lot of money. They were content with what they had. They loved their brothers and sisters in the Lord and the people around them, and they loved their church dearly. They were good people. We call them the salt of the earth. Again, not recognizing the reference to the Sermon on the Mount. You said, Jesus, my disciples will be the salt of the earth, preserving what is good, destroying what is evil. So we have both those aspects to work on if we want to produce in our families good, honest, reliable people. They've got to see in you and me, parents, grandparents, something that they can relate to with pleasure. I mean, one of the great joys of doing this podcast, which I didn't expect at all. I couldn't see the point of doing it. I didn't think that it was bad enough to need someone like me jumping in at this stage. But you who are watching have been a blessing to me because of the responses that come. I mean, even one or two would have been worthwhile, but it's more than that. And most importantly, of course, within my own extended family, my grandchildren, that my grandchildren will listen to their old codger of a grandfather is astonishing to me. But not only do they listen, they take notes, and they are modifying their lives in the way that I suggest. So I'm going to have great-grandchildren who are being brought up the Jewish way, where fathers are reading the scriptures to their children and seeing that they know them. They will come back even if they wander it, as inevitably will happen with some, but most of them so far not, thank God. And they introduce their friends. That astonished me even more, because I thought I would just be written off by that generation. But there's clearly something happening, especially to young men. Younger men, they're for once a bit behind the 8-ball in the spiritual dimensions of life. Normally they lead the way in the past. But currently in the world, it's young men who are seeking for meaning and purpose, especially blue-collar kids who must be worried about what their future's going to look like. But hopefully it will not be what they think. I mean, AI, I don't expect to be, what shall I say, a source of unlimited good. You can already see the way it's being abused, and it's undermining our society. We have to find ways to teach now where we can actually find out whether the children and the students at university level are actually growing as human beings, as well as some sort of fodder for the industrial machine, which is what they tend to feel like. Who cares about me? Those at the top just make millions, and they lecture the rest of the world on carbon dioxide and fly in private jets jets to Davos. They ought to fall out of the sky with embarrassment. The only good bit is they're almost certainly totally wrong about carbon dioxide. The lifeblood of every living creature is carbon, so that's where the energy comes from, breaking down carbon chains. Rub their noses in that. But that's a digression. The young are looking for, above all else, for meaning. They say, what's the point? China has a huge problem. I've forgotten the phrase, but there are phrases amongst young Chinese who says it basically means let it rot. And what they're leaving to rot is the CCP and all their works. The only important thing to do, if you can, is to get out of China and get to somewhere like Canada, which is apparently the first choice. Why? Because there's no hope in the materialistic system they have. And having been so stupid as to have a one-child policy, when they find out they don't have enough people, well, sorry, I have a jerky hand and I knocked the microphone off. I hope that you got what you needed. But you can't reverse a one-child policy and suddenly be back to where you were before. That's going to take 20 years. And the warlike intentions of their president, their leader of the Communist Party, cannot be fulfilled for purely people reasons. I mean, when they tried fighting the Indians up in the Himalayas, they got a bloody nose very quickly, because you can't take young little emperors who've been spoiled in every possible way and turn them into soldiers with a few weeks' training. And furthermore, you can't expect to be able to carry the population with you if they've only got one son who is going to keep the family name alive. When you've got several children, if one of them is killed fighting for the country, everybody else, when they've got over their pain, are proud of what he did. But if you've only got one, that's not going to happen. And that's where they've got to. And they're almost certainly lying about the number of people who live there anyway. Yeah. Terrifying situation. But the young, that they would do what they're doing, letting their parents go to work to earn some money, and they sit at home and do the housework and keep those things going, but they're not prepared to work seriously because they don't see a future. That's the difference. Whereas the whole history of Christianity was led in an opposite direction by their response to martyrdom. In the early centuries, they demonstrated to the Roman authorities that this was real, because they really didn't care if they were killed. They'd take their own children into the arena with them rather than have them brought up as pagans. That is astonishing. And it destroyed the Roman Empire, basically, the pagan side of it. Constantine did what he had to do. He was smart enough to realize the world has changed. And it had. But note how long the time course is for these changes. Centuries. Now, in Africa, where we spent quite a lot of time, there's a real Pentecostal excitement about church a lot of the time. But it lacks depth. And there's no question about that. And this is because it is an illiterate society in the sense of it doesn't have a tradition of books. And so, yeah, you can have some reasonable biblical exposition, and people repent, and they ask for forgiveness, and they're told you must forgive if you wish to be forgiven. But then they don't get the next bit. They don't say, therefore, you've got to renew your mind, because you've got to start thinking, meditating, and working out for yourself and your families how you get rid of these bad habits. They're not wiped out by a moment of ecstatic contact with God. He doesn't apparently use it. He could do that, I've seen that happen. I have one friend whose problem after fighting in the Falkland Wars, and I haven't heard from this guy for a while. I hope perhaps I might hear from him again as a result of this podcast. But he came back to Ottawa after the war, fighting in the Falklands, and he was an alcoholic. And he was working in a restaurant, and he was planning to steal a barrel of beer. That's the kind of state he was in. And then God took away his desire for alcohol. It just disappeared, bang, like that. It was a miracle. Because he had to sober up. And he did sober up and become a serious Christian. I'd love to know what happened to him. So that can happen. The miracles that Jesus did. Go and sin no more. The woman was saved from being brutally slaughtered by men who undoubtedly had done exactly what they wanted to kill her for. And he said, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Go and sin no more needs to appear in church a lot more than it does at the moment, because that's our responsibility. We all have habits that we need to work on, and many of them we will not get rid of in this lifetime, but they can be controlled, but only by the use of the means of grace. Every young person who's a Christian going to university, I think, needs to have Acts 2:22 written over their desk. They continued in the apostles' doctrine, breaking of bread, fellowship, and prayers. Those are the sine qua nons for survival. Now, this is already taken far too long, oh dear. Well, we'll see how far we get. This week's reading, because every week it's what I've been reading that matters. This book, I hope it comes out the right way, but because on my screen, of course, it's backwards. Oliver O'Donoghue, The Disappearance of Ethics. It's the Gifford Lectures from, what year was it published? Relatively recently. 2024. And this brings me back to where I started. My intuition was that lectures on ethics wouldn't work. I don't know why. It just seemed to me that that's not the way it goes, because it doesn't account for the fact that the most ethical person I know have no education in the modern elite's view of what education is. When we started our ethics lectures in Ottawa, I said to the dean at the time, who was a nice liberal gentleman, Dean Seeley, a nice, kind man, I met him at a cocktail party and said, I see you're starting an ethics program. What do you expect the result to be? And he said, well, better ethics. I said, I don't think that will happen. In fact, the guy you've chosen to organize that course for you actually says, I only teach ethics, I don't practice them. He didn't know what to say. And of course, medical student behavior is much more a consequence of the world in which they live than it is in which lectures they listen to, particularly in the modern world where they don't remember any of them. It's a memorize and dump world, and that cannot take us forward. Even people with good minds have had them got at by the education system. So they're not reading. I mean, the number of people who read books now is negligible. I mean, when I was a teenager, I read most of the Hardy novels in one summer. I just was in the sort of depressed mode, I suppose. I wasn't depressed, but somehow those rather depressing stories made some kind of sense for me. Looking back, I suppose it's because he didn't pretend that life was good for everybody, and life was pretty boring for a lot of people from my point of view. Working class people, well, the names in England even tell you that you did what your father did for a long while. So you had names, the baker, the miller, they're all there, those names. You went from generation to generation. And basically the Brits that I grew up with were Stoics. The Christian bit had got lost from the working class. In the early 20th century, they didn't go to church, but they still had the Bible read in school, and taking it out, especially to the degree that it was done in North America, has had the absolutely predictable outcome. The only ethics you can get from a purely material world are not very exciting and don't include love, compassion. They're not rational parts of that. There is no rational ethics derivable from Darwin. You do what benefits your genes. That's the principle. The very fact that we can't live with it teaches you that it's not an adequate principle. Surely evolution occurs, but it's not an adequate explanation of everything. In the beginning, something. I mean, great scientists in the quantum physics field, in cosmology and molecular biology, all acknowledge that something started all this. We can't get back to a simple beginning. Even the Big Bang is an incredibly unlikely thing in many ways, and it still raises all the questions. Molecular biology is not compatible with evolution as the sole explanation of everything. Something from nothing was recognized as stupid a long while ago. So, how do you teach ethics? Well, Paul just says, love your spouse, love your children, pay your workers. What could be simpler? And wouldn't that be a world that was so much better if just those three things were done? Husbands loving wives, wives loving husbands, producing children who knew what love was, and paying your workers a living wage as you went along. What could be better? We can't achieve it in the world at large, and at the moment we have the World Economic Forum types who have so much money, and all they do is collect more. I don't see them being charitable on the scale they should be. It's a mere pittance that they give out, and they don't know how to give out love. That's what we really need. You know who loves you. Hopefully there are some in your life. If you're in a good church, you will find they love you in the sense that they will look after your needs when they come along. We're going to need a lot more work in that direction because our world is falling apart at that level. So what do we do about this? Well, the book that I just showed you, O'Donovan's The Disappearance of Ethics, that's quite a title, isn't it? And the point that he's making is that even Kant couldn't connect his subjective recognition of the wonder of the universe from his acknowledgement that within himself he found oughts, the moral law within. He didn't give any account of where that came from. No animal has it. They just have reflexes. We were made in the image of God, says the Bible. And that makes sense. Not that we are God. We're a pale reflection. But what is the image of God? He has no material existence. He is love. His truth. His justice. All the immaterial things which we've forgotten how to talk about. But they're real. When you're jilted from someone you thought you really loved and you thought really loved you, is that real? Of course it is. Real in an incredible way. But it has no material existence. You can't measure a pound of jilting. It doesn't belong in that world. The move from recognizing the immaterial, the things that matter most of all, love, justice, truth, honor, forgiveness, those immaterial things which were pushed to one side with the arrival of the reductionistic world of the beginning of the late 13th century, and going on until the 19th, where speaking with Darwin, and falling apart now, thank God, because Darwin is not an adequate explanation. And all the great scientists now, at least they show some courtesy towards serious Christian thought, which is important. So O'Donovan's recognition that ethics, unlike philosophy, it is not something that you can write down and people follow in the same way. Ethics is much more like a meditation on what you know to be true about human nature and how we can think about what that means and how it is to be worked out. The two bits of Kant's world cannot be brought together. The moral life is essential to a successful society. So thinking that you can put everything right by material means is foolishness in the extreme. I don't know what Tom Sowell believes, but Tom Sowell clearly knows that there were people in his life who cared about him and made his life possible. And they did it out of the goodness of their hearts, out of the culture from which they came. Now, reductionism, instead of looking at people who are good or bad and anywhere on the spectrum, we go for silly things like racism. I mean, the only thing to do with racism is take no notice of it. Once you start pointing a finger and saying someone's racist, you're being racist yourself at a different level. No, it's got to come from somewhere else. I mean, I've been privileged to have in my life, because of our travels, people that I have loved from all racial backgrounds. That's what happens. I can find my brothers and sisters around the world with the greatest of ease because they're all connected. I mean, when this stuff about everybody in the world being connected by, was it 5 handshakes? I can't remember exactly. I was skeptical. It happened that I'd read that stuff on the plane on the way to a conference, and I couldn't believe it. Then I thought, well, let's do a thought experiment. How many handshakes do I need to get to the Pope, John Paul, and George Bush? He was president at the time. I thought, I won't get to either of those in 5 handshakes. Within a few hours, I knew actually it took 2 handshakes to get to the Pope. And later that evening at dinner, an obstetrician gynecologist from Texas said, "John, what have you been thinking about?" And so I told him, and he laughed. He said, "You only need 1 handshake to get to George Bush. I went to school with him." What a world we live in. And of course, from the Christian point of view, we are incredibly connected. There are some people who travel a lot, like I'm an example, I suppose. I could get to any continent in the world quite easily in many places. Probably most of the big cities in the world will be no more than 2 handshakes. So our world is like that, and we need to celebrate it. You can find your brothers and sisters where you go if you look. When you go on holiday, you should think long and hard. How do I find a church where I might, have that aspect of the holiday be good as well? And you can think about it before you go. We need depth in our lives. So one other thing I've read this week, I'll put it up for you. This is from the October 2025 edition of First Things. And I normally read Ephraim Radner, who's the back page writer. One of the early articles I'll read each time. But somehow I missed this one. And it's called Bring Back Beautiful Sermons. And he talks about Mary and Matthew and Mary and Martha and Augustine's sermon on them, which he says modern people would look upon as being a bit disorganized. They want one point, nowadays. It used to be 3 points, but now apparently it's 1 for many of them, that you then approach from various ways, and you do it all in 10 to 15 minutes. A real sermon, no. And Augustine, as he says, and I'm not going to argue with him, perhaps the greatest preacher after Paul, he doesn't say that, but the world has known. But he's very discursive. He says, even in the Mary and Martha one, he says, we're told either you fall into the Martha mode all the while, and you need more of the Mary mode. You need both. They've got to come together, and we are meant to have both. And then he says he will bring in scripture from here and from there, and it's not organized as well as we would like, although it's organized by the Holy Spirit at work in the heart and mind of Augustine. The reason I allow this podcast to run the way I do instead of reading great chunks is because there's only one reason, I think, for giving a lecture these days. I mean, you can find the information you want with the greatest of ease. What you can't find easily is to be able to distinguish between real information and pseudo-information, in other words, lies. We don't know how to do that. I changed my teaching habits in the 1990s because I couldn't catch the cheats even then. Now it's even harder. So I had to start teaching them how to dissect a paper, take it to pieces, compare with others, and find out whether there's enough reason for you to believe it or not. And my exam at the end of the year every time was not cheatable, because I didn't know what the paper was going to be, which paper I was going to use until a few days before, because I wanted a paper that raised the kind of issues that I'd been wanting them to think about, but had no commentary. And AI couldn't do anything about it either, really. It would do something. It would be easier now than it was then, because they had free access to all the world's literature and to people. But they had to do it in one day, so they couldn't really... I don't know how far the cheating went. I couldn't get rid of it completely, but I do know that I found students who were actually good at this, and they were not being rewarded. You get rewarded for giving the right answers at the right time. If you have a mind that says, but isn't there a problem here? That will lose you marks. But in my course, that's the way you got marks. So A's and A pluses were very rare in my course, but I do remember giving 2 A pluses to students who'd been B students when I looked at their record, but they went on to an academic career because they had a mind that was inquisitive and cared about logic and knew how to read. Now we don't know how to read. How many of you have read a book in the last week and even have the discipline to read a paragraph and stop and say, okay, what's the point of that paragraph before you go on to the next one? Just sit down at the end of a reading session and say, what have I actually learned? What do I know? What questions have arisen? Do you read to your children? Do you insist that there are screen-free days in your life, or better still, whole chunks of days that are free from screens? We have got to resuscitate reading. There's a reading list on my website, johnpatrick.ca. They are books that I've actually enjoyed, as opposed to books that I'm supposed to enjoy. And if you've never read a really big novel that you really enjoyed, start with Island of the World by Michael O'Brien, published by Ignatius. It's good for summer because once you start it, you will find it very difficult to put down, but it's not a bad addiction. We have had dozens of people in our life who say, you introduced me to Michael O'Brien. Thank you so much. Peter Crace says, and I have no reason to argue with him, that Michael O'Brien is the greatest living Christian novelist. So go in peace and have a good read this week. Read October 2025. You can easily find it online. Ephraim Radner, bring back beautiful sermons. And if you're being got at by ethics, or if you have to teach ethics, particularly if you have to teach ethics, read this book, because then you will see that the legitimate way to teach ethics is to take real stories and discuss what made it possible for that person to behave in such an ethical and admirable way. Have a good week.